Okay, everybody. Just waiting on a few more folks here. We'll get started in about a minute or two. Let's see, we have a good turnout, so we'll give me 1 minute and we'll get started here. Okay, everybody. I'm gonna get started here. We have a few more people coming in still, but I'll get started here with the introduction. Thanks for everybody for signing up for today's webinar and attending. My name is Joe Nupieri, one of the founders here of Compass. I'm here with my partner Scott Brittman.
Hello, everyone.
And really just wanted to cover a lot of topics today about succession planning. I know it's a hot topic. We're going to try to dive into as many high level topics as we can. And I do encourage anybody, there's a chat feature. You could raise your hand, ask questions. I feel that it does gear the conversation in different directions. So always interactive. Try to make it as interactive as possible. Scott and I have been doing this for about 12, 13 years, maybe even a little more now, helping financial advisors with their succession plans, working on valuations, doing acquisition opportunities. So with that in mind, let's go right into the material here and give you a sense of what we're going to be covering. So first, I'll just go quickly through this. So, a few things. One is evaluating succession options. Just different options that you have for succession. And oh, there's a question here. Sorry, before I get into that, yes, the presentation slides will be shared with everybody, as well as we're going to be sending a practice profile out to everybody as well if they would like to, get a sense of what their practice is valued at and go into that a little bit further. So we'll be doing that at no additional cost, but certainly a perk for joining the webinar today. So I do appreciate that. All right, so back to that, just evaluating the succession options, finding the right successor, which is paramount here. I think that's mainly what we do as far as it's a lot of matchmaking. So that's important. Structuring the deal, always, there's so many different ways. We're seeing more and more different ways, even more than we have on our slide for that here these days. So, very, very important topic. Valuating your business, how to maximize it, items that will affect the valuation, and timeline options for your succession. So, let's dive right into it. Scott, you want to kick us off here? Let's see. Okay.
All right, so evaluating your succession options, identify potential internal successors within the firm. Probably going to be your easiest bet of a successful transition is to not have to repaper clients and kind of keep them in-house, especially if you're working with a junior or you have somebody younger that is you're working with already. Obviously, would be your easiest transition possible. Exploring external options like mergers, sell and stays, or full or partial acquisition is going to be another option for you. Obviously, you'll have to repaper at that point, and typically, you may get more money, honestly, if you are selling externally and have to go through that process. And there's a lot of different options. Again, I know a lot of you probably, you may not have that crystal ball that's telling you, when you want to leave, but just know that a lot of these buyers are flexible in terms and how long you want to stay on. Either it's open ended or an actual term, but a lot of them are open to different structures and limits on terms. So, considering grooming and mentoring new talent, bringing in a junior. Those can get a little tricky, I would say. You're putting a lot of eggs in your basket as opposed to, well, you're putting a lot of eggs in your basket as you bring in somebody, train them, And then, if they decided it's not for them after a year or so, now you put all that work into it and you're starting over from square one. So I would be careful with something like that. I think if you have a family member or something like that, it could be a good venture for you to do something like that and grooming new talent. But I would be weary of bringing in somebody you don't know and, get
It's yeah, it's tough. I think it's like Scott said, and he makes a great point. I think it's just a tough thing to bring in. I think we talk to a lot of folks who want to have that junior, bring him in, have it, but a lot of folks when they get to a certain point, they don't want to have to spend the time training, and then if 2, 3 years down the road, it's not a good fit, then you start from square one. So yeah, I think it can work out really well, but I also feel like it's more complications could arise from that than I think even the top two, considering that repapering is part of that as well. So
And you're going to want to assess the financial and operational feasibility of each option. I think that if you're, for instance, you're with LPL, you're going to have a lot easier of a time finding another advisor that's going to fit your philosophies and fit with, who you think your clients are going to work with best. If you're from a smaller BD, it may not be, realistic to find somebody within that BD, and you may have to look out, externally, and may have to repaper. So you really got to kind of sit down. I always tell people make a pros and cons list, make a non-negotiable list, things that really are, non-negotiable for you. If you don't want to repaper, and that's very high on your list, make it make it known to the person you're talking to up front about that, and just make sure you figure out what are your non-negotiables.
yeah, and that kind of brings us right into the next slide. So that was a good transition. But I think it is finding the right successor. I think is one of the most important things here in this part. And I think when we talk to people, a lot of it is a matchmaking process. But what's helpful to know as you start to consider, a possible successor either now or down the line, like Scott had mentioned, what are your must-haves? Is it somebody that has to be within your broker dealer? Is it somebody that has to be in your geographical location? Do they have to manage their money with a certain way? Is the book makeup have to be a certain way? All of that, you're never going to find the perfect. I mean, maybe you can, but you're going to try to check as many of those boxes as you can, and I think that's going to put you in a good spot. Like there, I know when people list their practices on like a listing service, they're posting their practice for sale. They're getting 500 inquiries from people around the country. So it becomes difficult to sort of weed through that and find out, okay, well, out of these people, I mean, they're all different parts of the country. Who's going to be the good fit? Who do I spend the time introducing myself to and building a relationship with? So I think what we take a sort of a different approach than say a listing service, and work with the buyer and seller and work with the seller to say, hey, what are your must-haves? What are your deal breakers? Is it, you don't want somebody somebody who doesn't have a CFP, or somebody who doesn't have a certain member on their staff, or I mean, I've even heard crazy scenarios that maybe aren't that crazy, but somebody, if they don't have a bachelor's or I mean a master's degree or some sort of fancy degree, they don't even want them to take over their business. It's really going to depend on the client base, and you want to make sure that the person that you're bringing in is also going to share your values with the clients. I think that's huge when it comes to retention on these opportunities. So I think that's a good thing to know. The personality, I think that's the most important part. When we're introducing these people, you have to hit it off. They have to like each other. If you don't like the potential, if you find the buyer is arrogant, or there's a lot of different things that are rubbing you the wrong way, or some red flags, yeah, I mean, that's not going to work, and I think you could usually tell if personalities are going to line up with a 20 or 30 minute phone call. I mean, things could unravel, many things could happen from there, but you might get a good sense from that initial call, just to kind of feel it out and say, like, hey, very informal, just hey, where'd you go to college? How do you manage your clients? Yeah, things like that are really good to sort of touch on that initial call. And whether it takes one or maybe it takes five or six or seven, if you start to go more than that, I think it becomes a little overwhelming. You really want to try to narrow down who would be a good fit within five or less if you can. And then really just talk to them, build relationships with all of them, figure out how their companies work, what a potential transition would look like. Investment portfolio, are they are they transactional? Do they do a lot of annuities or insurance based, or are they mostly fee based? A lot of advisors now want fee based business, and it shows when we talk about valuations in one of the upcoming slides. But I think that overall, it's you want to try to match the investment if possible, and I think there are people who will look for practices like a book with mutual fund A shares. And they love those types of practices because they could now convert those over to fee based accounts. So, but as a seller, you would want to convert those to fee based yourself to get to maximize the value on the valuation, or you would look at maybe an earn out, something like that, which we'll talk about as well. Again, portability of the clients. Some I know like the old River Source with Ameriprise. I don't know if it's the same way anymore, but kind of it was proprietary. So many of the clients that they had in something like that wouldn't be able to get transferred over to certain broker dealers. And I still think it's the case, and some different insurance companies, and you just have to make sure the entire book is portable because you're not going to want to sell your book in chunks for the most part. If 20% of your practice isn't going to move over to this guy or the potential buyer, and they're not valuing it at all, you want to find somebody who's going to value it. And I always tell people your book is worth what buyers, what somebody's willing to pay for it. So you want to make sure you find somebody who actually is able to take on the entire book, in most cases, as opposed to just saying, hey, I'll sell you 80% of my practice and then I'll find somebody else to get the other 20%. Like that usually is not the best way to go about it. And just weigh the pros and cons. If you have five different people, you like this about this person, you don't like this about this person. It helps you sort of determine at the end of the day kind of where we're at, and where you're at and who you like better. So and I know we're sort of going through this sort of fast. So if anybody has any questions, or any of you want to raise your hand or into the chats thus far about anything. Plus, we'll do a question and answer session at the end as well, where usually with a big turnout like we have here today, tends to open up some different conversations as well, which is valuable. So let's move on to the next one here. Okay, structuring the sale. Scott, take that.
Yep. So you're going to want to look at, upfront, your upfront payment or your down payment going to range anywhere from 10 to, I mean, this says 10 to 50%. I think it's more like 30 to 50%. 10% is more of like an earn out type upfront deal that you're going to get. So I would probably look anywhere from, well, let's say 25 to 50% down. I think that if you're working with an internal broker or an internal rep, and you're not, transitioning the book externally, I think, getting that top tier 50% down is a lot easier just because you're going to be, basically, changing rep codes, not having to repaper. So a lot easier of a transition for everybody. And then there's two different options when it comes to the financing of the rest of the deal. You can either finance the deal yourself, or you can make them go through bank financing. There's pros and cons to both. Seller financing, it's typically going to be, an interest rate anywhere from 5 to, I would say 7 or 8% now, over anywhere from 3 to, I would say 5 or 6 years. I think the benefits to that is, you're collecting the interest on it. That will alleviate some of the tax implications that you have on your capital gains or your ordinary income, however your accountant structures that over X amount of years. So that could, help you recoup a little bit of that. But on the downside, now you're responsible for kind of being the creditor on that. So if they do default, unfortunately, your active recourse is going to be taking back your book or going to court. And, we know who wins when it goes to court. It's usually the lawyers. So, not something that you want to get involved with. You want to make sure you do your due diligence on these people that are buying the book. Very common to ask for their own tax returns. And, that's all stuff that you'll go through on bank financing and, kind of making sure that they're set up well financially and that they're going to be a good, I guess,
Yeah,
person to kind of give a loan to basically.
it's like an insurance for you in a sense too, because you know you're getting money from the bank. So and what's good is that they do, like Scott said, they pay you out typically after 12 months as long as the retention numbers are met. So it's a good way to do it. It's also a great way for the buyer. They can spread out from a cash flow standpoint. They could pay this out over 10 years, where seller financing might only be over 3 to 5 years. So and then earn out. Well, we have a question, but I'll cover this. It says, how do you evaluate your book from selling price perspective? So we'll cover that sort of in the next slide. We'll go through valuations and kind of tell you a little bit about how that works. So if you still have any questions after we go through that slide, we will we'll address that on that part.
The last Joe went over bank financing with you guys, but that's something that we can help with too. And I would be upfront with the seller. I'm sorry, with the buyer too. I mean, if you don't want to hold a note, be upfront and honest with them at first, and let them know, hey, I'm not looking to hold a note. I would prefer you going through bank financing. And again, the pros of that is you're paid out in 12 months, as long as retention numbers are hit, and you don't have to worry about being the bank at that point. So that's total, a lot of buyers are doing that now. So it's very common in the industry. So it's not a really crazy ask at this point. And the last thing is a percentage of revenue or an earnout. Taking a percentage of the revenue from the buyer for 2 to 5 years. I would say 5 years, 4 years is probably more typical of an earnout where you'll basically start out probably taking more of the revenue over the first couple of years, and then it evening itself out, and then it's spreading more towards the buyer at that point. And it's a really good option for somebody that has funds that can be converted over to manage money, because then you can kind of share in the upside of the book, as it's being made more valuable. So that's always a good option as well.
Yep, especially if what the reason somebody would do that is if you feel like you have 5 years or so left, and or even more maybe, and you feel like you can still grow the book, right? You're not going to do an earnout if you just want to get out of the business in a year or two and sell, unless you feel like you can get all of those on your own converted. So the way that it'll work is a buyer will pay you for revenue converted into fee-based accounts if you're doing the work to convert them. If you're selling the book to him and they're all mutual fund A shares and they have to do all of the work to convert it, that's usually where you won't get compensated for that upside. So an earnout is good for somebody like that. The last thing I'll add on this, and there are a couple of we're seeing so many different creative ways now that people are structuring these deals. One way is also somebody buying in a percentage of their practice over a certain period. So you might buy 20% of somebody's book over a 5 year period. And that allows you to just, you're selling chunks of your book. And then as you have your succession plan already built in, because you're working with their firm, but they're buying you out every 20% over 5 years or whatever the breakdown is. That's also a pretty good way of structuring it. It's going to depend on the seller gets to hold the cards in these negotiations. So you really get to kind of dictate how the terms are, to be honest. And many of the buyers, the good buyers, are willing to be flexible and say, "Hey, listen, I really like you. I like your practice. You know, I'm willing to be flexible on what you're looking for, and that's those are things you want to communicate with them, because I think it'll just get and sometimes you won't know how to communicate that with them. So companies like myself, ours, and other companies will sort of help you, kind of guide you in the right direction. Like, hey, if you want to stay on for 5 years, why don't you try this or why don't you try that? So there's a lot in there. And then the last thing on the structuring side that we've also been seeing is if somebody buys kind of the same concept in a sense, but buying in like 50% of the book, and then they keep the other 50% of the book, they're still working that percentage, but they get paid out on the first 50%, and then maybe in a year or two or three or four, whatever, the remaining part of that book is bought out. Buyers love that because you're still around, and sellers kind of like it because they can monetize a piece of their business, but also continue to stay on if they're not really ready to retire. So um, let's see, we got a question. Yeah, generally, what percentage of the revenue do you start receiving from the buyer? Um, yeah, so you mean like what? So if you're selling a practice, you're it depends. Like I just mentioned, it depends on how much of that percentage you're going to be selling, right? If you're selling 100% of the revenue, then they're going to pay you a multiple based on that. So we'll kind of go into what the valuations are and how that kind of works, but you're basically, it depends on what percentage of the book you're looking to sell, and then they'll basically pay you for that portion of the revenue, and then they start receiving, and then, you will receive, like, you don't receive revenue. I'm trying to think, like, generally what percentage of revenue you start receiving from the buyer. Like, you're not going to receive any revenue from the buyer. So yeah, like in an earnout, you would. That's kind of the percentage on that. But and it could be any way. It could be, hey, listen. And now I think I understand a little better. So sorry about that. But I think it would be like maybe you start out 50 or 60% of the revenue for the first 2 years, like Scott said, or maybe it's more than that. And then it starts to go down to 40% in year three or 20% in year four. So I think that's more of the earnout structure, if you were referring to that. So yeah, that's kind of how that would look like. But the numbers are really you have to work it back into the equation. So if the book is valued at $1 million and you're only getting a percentage of revenue for the next 5 years, what would that, Okay, so your current revenue is 2 million. So yeah, I think if you did 2 million, let's just say your practice at a 3x, right, was, and at 2 million, you would look at EBITDA a little bit as well, which we'll talk about here. But yeah, I mean, let's just say a standard 3x multiple on 2 million, whatever. Right? It's you probably wouldn't come out to that, but if the valuation is, let's say, 8 million or 6 million, right? You would work an earnout to work that number out. So, if you're doing 2 million in revenue annually, you would say, okay, what do I need to pay him to get to that 6 million? And you would back that out. So that way, if you're growing the book during those 4 or 5 years, you're just going to keep getting a higher, the revenue, the percentage you're getting is higher because the revenue is going up, but that's how he's paying you back, is saying like, all right, I need to do 80% of revenue, pay him out of that for the first 2 years, and then I'm going to drop it down to 50, 40, and then whatever it backs out to that 6 million. But it could also be worth more than 6 million if you're growing the practice throughout the time that you're there. All right, so let's go. I think we covered a lot of structure. It seems like there's a lot of valuation questions, which is pretty typical. I know it's something that people want to know what everything looks like here. So I'll let kind of you want that, or you want me to do that? Okay, so well, I'll do the first valuation part. Scott will kind of touch on some of the second. So some of the stuff to prepare for on the business valuation, and this isn't necessarily with the practice profile that we're going to send out to everybody. I think that's really just a high level. So we're not going to ask you for P&Ls and all of that kind of stuff yet. Anyway, that's stuff that an eventual buyer would want to see. P&Ls are usually more used when it's more of a business than just a book. Somebody who's doing 3 million in revenue, who has multiple advisors working under them, multiple staff, offices, for all of that. You're going to want to see P&L for somebody like that. If it's just a LPL to LPL or Osaic to Osaic deal, and it's a 40-50 million dollar book, and all you're buying is the book, commission statements, revenue breakdowns from the broker dealer should suffice on that. Even tax returns are only really needed if the buyer's using a bank to finance in most cases. But if it's that more the bigger business model, tax returns probably would be requested by a certain buyer anyway. um, knowing the valuation, having a fair market value of it, and understanding that. Like, these are all things these things on this slide are things you would want to do, or have an idea of before you start getting into conversations with potential buyers. So you want to make sure you have an idea of your valuation. You want to know why it's that number, and just be really educated on that. Tax implications, capital gains versus ordinary income, also very important. Most of these independent deals are structured as capital gains, and you could certainly, as the seller, say to a buyer, I would like to structure this deal in a way that's favorable for me on the capital gain side. Ordinary income businesses are usually like, if you're working for a wirehouse and you get a W-2, you might get taxed the majority of it on ordinary income. I'm no accountant, so I'm certainly not going to give tax advice, but it also differs from state to state. We're here in New York, so somebody else in a different state, it could be different, and all of that. So you definitely want to consult your accountant on that, but also buyers will be amenable to at least structuring it in a way that is favorable for you on the tax side. So, and then lastly, seeking professional advice. I mean, whether it's worth, like, we don't charge the seller anything. So, like, not to do a shameless plug here, but like, we work with buyers all across the country, and we vet them out. We make sure that they have good financials, that a lot of them have done acquisitions before, and they're the ones that essentially compensate us, but we also get compensated on the purchase price. So we're not charging the seller anything in the way that we operate, but we also want to make sure that they get the best value for their practice, because that's how the buyer will compensate us on that side. So we kind of we're in alignment in that sense. Whether it's somebody like me or any of the other professionals out there, I mean, attorneys, I would really minimize the use of attorneys, only when it comes to maybe redlining purchase agreements and things like that you want them to look at. I do feel, and I've seen it over and over, is that when attorneys do get super involved, they sometimes try to make up for their fee they're charging, and they turn a simple standard purchase agreement into just filled with red lines. Next thing you know, the deal is dead when it really didn't have to be. So I like the KISS method on this, the keep it simple, stupid. And I think that's a lot of times, but you do want to consult your professionals as well. So just keep that in mind. We'll move on here. This is the part I think that most people are interested in. So I'll let Scott kind of take that over.
Yeah, so items that are going to affect your valuations, recurring revenue, it's obviously king, fee-based advisory, fee only renewals. I would say right now the multiples that we're looking at through us is 2.75 times to 3.25 times revenue on managed money, two times trails, and then I would say anywhere from 0 to 1 times like commission-based revenue, depending on what the product is. I mean, if it's something that's stuck in surrender for 7 years, you're probably not going to get paid out on something like that. You may get some sort of good faith money on something like that if you have a good book of a mix of managed money um, renewals and stuff like that. So that's going to be the biggest driver towards your valuation is going to be how much recurring revenue you have versus transactional. Number two, client demographics, age is a big one. Can you say that payout times again? Yeah. So 2.75 to 3.25 times managed money revenue, two times trails revenue, and then 0 to 1 times transactional revenue.
And that's a general rule of thumb. But yeah, every book is going to depend that, and that's what will
Yeah, I
define
mean, if
this.
you have a client, in like number two, if you have clients that are, older, over the age of 70, 75, that multiple is probably going to come down a little bit. If you have a book of 65-year-olds and, they're not pulling much out, that's going to, give you a bump on the multiples that go up. Number of households, another thing that's going to do that. If you have $100 million with 100 clients, your book's going to be more valuable than the book that's 100 million with 1,200 clients. So you those are all things that are going to make the multiple go up or down. But number one, the revenue stream is really what's going to determine the bulk of that. These other ones are going to give you little hits here, little hits there, little upticks here, little upticks there. And then how transferable is your client base and their assets to a new firm? I mean, if you have proprietary assets at Ameriprise that are not going to transfer over. You may not get, you want to try to stay within the Ameriprise channel to kind of keep those there, or you're going to be giving off assets that you're not going to get paid on. So, those are things that you're going to want to keep in mind when looking at your valuation of your own book.
Yep. And some people are hearing even more crazy multiples out there, but honestly, I think we like to keep it pretty standard. I mean, you could, like Scott, I mean, I've seen as low as 2.5x on the fee based and as high as, people wanting 4x, but it's how it's structured. I think, most advisors aren't willing to just go out and offer 4x of revenue. You could certainly ask for that, and they might find creative ways to sort of structure that to because it's got to make sense for them too, right? So there's a give and take on these deals usually where when we do a lot of the mediation and negotiations. It's always, hey, you gotta, everybody's gotta make sacrifices, but I think as long as you're both working together and both open to, different ideas and that's usually where these will work. So, kind of moving on to the timeline of it, I think, this is one of the topics that we talk about to people mostly on the phone, I would say, only because there's never really a timeline. Nobody really has a timeline. I mean, you might, if you're ready to sell in a year and you want out, or, you're 68 years old, you want to be out by 70. Like some people are like that. And, finding the younger generations are more apt to sell their business in their 60s. The older generations are hanging around in their 70s and even 80s, believe it or not, a lot of times. And hey, if they feel healthy, they like what they do, that's great. I think having a succession though is important, just due to what could happen if you don't have a succession plan in place. In fact, we ran into it last year. We were working on getting a deal done with an advisor. He unfortunately passed away, and his book went from 1.6 million to down to 600,000. Thankfully, his wife had a lot of relationships with the clients, so the buyer was able to maintain that. But not having a plan at all is, certainly not the best thing for your clients, because if something happens, they just get dispersed all around. But kind of going off topic there, but talking about the timeline. So, yeah, most people say 5 years. It's a thing that we want to do. And then, like we mentioned earlier, if you want to be around for longer, you do an earn out. Maybe it's just a contingency plan. Maybe all you need is a buy sell arrangement, or somebody that says, hey, the value of my book is X. If I something happens to me, you're going to buy the book at X amount. I think that buy sell agreements are good for somebody internally with your firm. I don't know many buyers who would sign a buy sell agreement with somebody who's not already over it with their firm. Because if you think about it, right now you got a guy with LPL who's buying your book and you're with Osaic. And you now locked him in to say, if I pass away, you're buying my business for $1 million, no matter what. So, I mean, I'm sure you could add different clauses in there and things like that, with retention, potentially, but it's just very risky on their part without having, the clients be in the same firm and without knowing any of them. So that's why you just kind of, if you're going to do it, you do that with somebody internally. But obviously, no money changes hands. Maybe you do a life insurance policy out on one another. And then just making sure that the well structured implementation process. I think after the sale is important. How you do that, how you like sort of not I wouldn't say I'm not going to say sell it to your clients, but how you communicate it to your clients is very important. It's usually something like, hey, I'm sticking around for a little while longer. I found this great advisor who shares the same values, and I know he's going to do really well for you guys. I'm not going anywhere yet. I'll be around for the foreseeable future, but I will be slowly stepping out over the years. And this is the guy that I feel is going to, something like that. And maybe a letter goes out, or maybe there's an event that is thrown with the buyer's clients and your clients. It's sort of like a meet and greet, get everybody to know each other, things like that. That's going to help in the retention. And, most of these retention clauses right now are set at about a 90% retention. So, I don't know if we touched on the retention at all in this, but basically how a typical retention clause works is, usually in the first 12 months. So that's kind of where you as the seller sort of have skin in the game on these deals. You need to make sure you're helping to transition the clients over and that they're over to the new firm. So most buyers, if it's internally, there might not be a retention on it at all. But a lot of times there is. So they want to see 90% of the assets come over within the first 12 months for your business to be paid in full. If less than that come over, then you're now, now the value of your practice overall starts to get devalued. So there's a 10% buffer essentially where, you could have some attrition, lose a few clients. The market value, the market goes down, things like that. 10% is usually a pretty standard buffer. And then let's say you only bring over 80% of either, it's usually based on assets or revenue, depends on the book. But if only 80% of that practice come over, then now the value is getting devalued in many cases by 10%. So, because you've already got that 10% buffer and then it's another 10%. So that's kind of your standard retention. I've seen them structured many different ways, but we're seeing that more and more now. So I wanted to just touch on that because I think it's important for many people to expect that when asked by a potential buyer and not necessarily get insulted by it. I think it's just, buyer's skin in the game is the down payment. Seller's skin in the game is getting everybody over, and that's what makes a successful transition. So let's move on here. I know we still got some time, but let me just okay. So we'll just kind of Scott, you want to kind of give the lowdown
Yeah,
on
we're a consulting firm specialized in acquisition, succession planning services for advisors, all across the country. We're helping to facilitate the acquisitions and mergers by working closely with you guys, and really finding the best possible match for you guys. By, again, if you're within LPL, we'll go out and look for LPL. We probably already have somebody within LPL. We work with a lot of LPL reps. But if you're from an outside BD, if you need help with that, we don't charge for our services on your end. The foot of the bill is, the bill's footed by the buyers in our program. We can help you put a valuation on your book. We can help you figure out what might be the best deal structure for you, help negotiate price. That's all stuff that we do internally here. We typically look for advisors to come into our program, our buyers that have done this before, that have a proven track record of successful transitions, that have the infrastructure and capability of bringing on additional clients and or advisors. So those are all things that we look for as, really, positive characteristics of a potential buyer of your book of business. And, we offer all the resources. We offer the legal documentation. So like what Joe was saying before with your attorneys, you don't have to get them involved until you get to the red line stage. We have templates of agreements that we can put together for you guys. And basically, once you get to the point, now you got to involve the lawyer, have them red line, and then you can finalize. Um, our fee, asking a question here. What is your fee percentage of assets transferred? So our fee is based on the purchase price of your book of business. It is anywhere from a 4 to 6% of the sales price of the book of business that the buyer is buying. And again, that's a cost to them and not to you. It's not coming off of your bottom line as a seller. So that's all footed by the buyer.
Yep, and in some cases too, on the recruiting side. So in the case where you're not really looking to sell, maybe you just want to affiliate with a firm for a couple of years and then sell the book. That's covered under like recruiting. So we usually will charge a percentage of trailing 12 that moves over to the firm, and again, that's picked up by the buyer. And that's I don't know if anybody knows how many buyers, how many sellers to buyers to sellers there are out there. If anybody has a guess, put it in the chat. But it's eye opening. I mean, the average age of a financial advisor, depending on the report that you see, is anywhere from 59 to 62, 63. So it's an aging population, and the less younger folks are coming into the business. Yeah, I see some guesses here: 10 to 1, 5 to 1. It's honestly, it's more like 50 to 1. Despite the fact you would think it's less, but despite the fact that it's mainly just because it's an aging population, and there's a lot of advisors still left in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. But that's I think 50 to 1 is that number that we're seeing, where that's why it's so competitive out there, and firms like ours exist. It's quite the opposite of sort of real estate, right? Is that when you're buying and selling, you come up with a price and you sell it. But this, you have so much competition, especially in some of those larger areas. If you're trying to sell your book and it's a good book, you're not going to have any shortage of people wanting to buy it. It's just how do you find that right fit, right? And then let's see, we have a question here from Jeffrey. Thanks, Jeffrey. Fee is based on AUM or GDC. If you're our fee, it would be on a recruiting deal. So if you're not selling the business, it's off GDC. So that would be a percentage of GDC if you're not if the seller, we'll call them seller just to make it easy, but if the advisor who is merging under with another buyer, they pay us so like a recruiting fee. So it's pretty standard across the industry. We're at like usually 6% of the trailing 12. But if it's an actual purchase where there's purchase agreements signed and now all the clients are moving over and it's a 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 year purchase, that is based off the purchase price. So I hope that answered your question on that. Other than that, I don't want to take up too much. For some, this is lunchtime. And I do, we really thank you guys for joining us today. Any questions, certainly now is a good time to throw them in. If not, what we'll do is we're gonna send out an email to everybody with the practice profile and just just a couple of the replay copy of the webinar as well. And, probably be reaching out to everyone just to see, if we might be of some help. But feel free to send me an email or give us a call. And, we're happy to, assist you guys. Even if it's just a conversation and we're not high pressure. So if you call us, it's not like we're going to be like, hey, who do you want to sell your business to? Like we'll talk, we'll give you an accurate assessment of where your business is, and maybe some directions you can start thinking about in the future as you go. So, yeah, it looks like okay. Let's see. Nope. Okay, so we're good. So again, thanks everybody, and yeah, we look forward to speaking with everybody. Have a great day and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.